Discuss the data record and the history of climate alarmism as a political movement.
Well, thank you, Ken. And thank you for this opportunity to speak at this conference. I was privileged to speak at the first conference in New York. And as a Canadian, to be invited is especially welcome, and particularly a Canadian that is seen as somewhat of an extremist, because the New York Times once said, why did the Canadian cross the road? And the answer was to get to the middle. And what's amusing about that is, to an American that's an insult. A Canadian says, what's wrong with that? So very stereotypical reactions. I want to talk today about the fact that the IPCC has achieved its goal. And its goal was to demonize CO2 and to get the whole world focused on CO2. And it's done that to the point where all of the discussion is about CO2, and even incorrectly talking about carbon, which is a solid, and CO2 is a gas. And most of the public don't even know the difference between those two things. So they've achieved their goal very successfully. We as science and skeptics are essentially ignored. That the success has been achieved more because of the cold weather, which led to illogical statements like the cooling is due to warming, which even the scientifically ignorant public could understand was illogical. And, but the whole issue of CO2 and carbon still is driving all energy and climate agendas throughout the world. And of course, that was their objective. CO2 was guilty without evidence, because of course they thwarted the scientific method, and it was found guilty in contradiction to the evidence, because as we are now all aware, the temperature changes before the CO2. It is not the driver the other way around, as is the fundamental assumption that is made for the AGW hypothesis. What they've done is what I call premeditation. That is, this, of course, in law makes the crime much worse. That they premeditated their objective and set out to achieve it. And of course, that ended up with it being political. And they did this initially by narrowing the focus and research by the definition of climate change in Article 1. Very few people are aware that they define climate change as a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over considerable periods of time. They became aware that we were making this challenge about their narrow definition, so in the 2007 report, they changed the definition, but they didn't change any of the research that they were doing. And so it was simply another sleight of hand. And of course, the problem is you cannot determine that unless you know the amount of natural change there is. You can't possibly identify what impact humans are having. You have to know what is going on naturally, and we simply don't. And Hubert Lamb, who founded the CRU unit and would be absolutely mortified with what's gone on there, and I say that because I had the privilege of him helping me with my doctoral thesis, spent considerable time working with him. He also reviewed an article that I wrote. But he said in his autobiography, he said, it was clear that the first and greatest need was to establish the facts of the past record of the natural climate in times before any side effects of human activities could well be important. The IPCC have diverted all of the science into the CO2 issue, and I would argue that they've set climate science back 30 years. If you go and read the volume 2 of Lamb's incredible work of 1972, Climate Past, Present, and Future, it is ahead of anything that you're reading in the newspapers or the media or what climate science is generally being funded to research. The situation is worse now than it was when Lamb made this statement. And of course, here's a relatively simple systems diagram of the Earth's climate system. Now, this just shows the ocean input and the atmospheric. And somehow they managed to get the whole world focused on the atmospheric composition and specifically on CO2, to the exclusion of all other, virtually exclusion of all other variables and their changes. And here you see this in their forcings. The top left is the 2001 report showing the forcings, and in the bottom right is the 2007. You notice that they don't even mention water vapor, the most important greenhouse gas, not even listed. And then they have a level of scientific certainty in the 2001 report, which has disappeared in the 2007 report. And then the most bizarre thing, the only natural phenomenon that they include is solar irradiance. And the question is, why did they include that? It's completely illogical, and of course it allows them to show that the changes are not being caused by changes in the sun, which they anticipated would be the challenge to the CO2 argument. So the whole thing was orchestrated to achieve their goal. And here we see it. This is a page from a NOAA website. It says greenhouse gases and aerosols. The Earth's atmosphere is made mostly of nitrogen and oxygen with a small amount of trace gases mixed in. A tiny percentage of trace gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, and carbon monoxide contribute. No mention of water vapor. No mention of water vapor, the most important greenhouse gas. And down here, the atmospheric greenhouse gas is based on certain molecules, for example, carbon dioxide. Why stress that one? This is a political statement. This isn't a statement of science, and yet it's on national science data. And then you see here, I love this, what they're doing: innovate, incubate, and integrate. Isn't incubating, hatching a plot? I would suggest that's what they're doing here. The IPCC was established through the WMO, put the matter entire under the control of the bureaucrats. That's why Maurice Strong worked through them. He knew then he had direct input through the bureaucrats into each national weather agency. The problem, they funded only the side that was proving the hypothesis, thus thwarting the scientific method. This resulted in various consensus arguments that include Oresky's claim of no dissenting papers, dominance of peer review papers, and the national academies, and all those other consensus arguments that we've heard. And here's the most amazing thing. In their IPCC report, they say another unusual aspect of recent climate change is its cause. Past climate change were natural in origin, whereas most of the warming of the past 50 years are attributable to human activities. How can you say that if you're not looking at natural variability? It's simply incongruous to do that. I just selected out, this is from the 2007 Chapter 8, which is the modeling chapter, and I won't go through all of these, but just to give you an idea, that they do tell you how bad their science is. But because people only read the summary for policymakers, nobody goes and looks at this stuff. But here they say, nevertheless, models still show significant errors. Due to the limited resolution of the models use parameterization, the differences between parameterization are an important reason why climate model results differ. How can they differ if you're using the same basic methods and data? Since the TAR, few capacities to simulate soil moisture. Tremendous effort to collect and homogenize soil moisture at global scales, discrepancies estimate, and soil moistures remain. Soil moisture is a huge source of moisture and energy into the atmosphere. And if you've ever tried to study the boundary layer at that interface, you know that this is an important part of climate. Aerosols, of course, everybody knows their inability to deal with those. Our assessment that all problems remain, climate models are improving in their simulation of extratropical cyclones. What does that mean? Improving from where to where? Have you gone from Auschwitz to Dachau? Is that the improvement? So extratropical cyclones, middle latitude, they are the major transfers of energy from the tropical region to the polar regions. And they're saying that they're having problems. The total surface heat and water fluxes are not well observed. But that's the whole process of energy transfer. These errors in ocean heat uptake will have a large impact on the reliability of sea level projections. But what are we hearing about sea level projections? And it goes on and on. Evaluation of the land surface component in coupled models severely limited by lack of suitable observations. That's the albedo factor. Hydrological components of the runoff, very poor. Despite considerable effort since TAR, uncertainties remain in the representation of solar radiation in climate models. That's the one thing they looked at, and they said it's poorly represented. Blocking events are important classes of sectoral weather. The blocking systems in the middle latitude are absolutely essential to transfer of energy, surplus energy from the tropics to the deficits of the polar region. So you can go on through, due to the computational costs associated with the requirement of well-resolved stratosphere, the models employed for the current assessment do not generally include the QBO. Oh, that's a huge component of energy transfer. We'll just leave it out because we can't afford it. And I'll just finish with this one here on this page. For models to simulate accurately the seasonal variant pattern of precipitation, they must correctly simulate a number of processes, evapotranspiration, condensation, transport, that are difficult to evaluate at a global scale. One obvious problem is a lack of data. Africa's network of 1,152 weather watch stations, which provide real-time data and supply international climate archives, is just 1/8 the minimum density recommended by the WMO. And they wonder why they can't forecast rain and what's happening with precipitation. So I say the list goes on and on. An increase in CO2 causes an increase in temperature was a basic assumption. I remember when this graph first appeared, and Jousel, who was the lead author on it, said, don't rush to judgment, but they did. They said this shows that CO2 is causing temperature to increase. We now know that that's exactly the opposite, and even they acknowledge that. And then they say, nevertheless, over several decades of model development, they've consistently provided a robust and unambiguous picture of significant climate warming in response to greenhouse gases. The evidence shows exactly the opposite. So how can you say it's robust? The computer results were predetermined. They set out to prove the hypothesis contrary to the scientific method. They did not entertain the null hypothesis. That wasn't a consideration. Despite this, they convinced the world that CO2 is a serious problem. It's time to disband the IPCC completely. Restrict the WMO and all national weather agencies to data collection and dissemination. Get the research out of the hands of government. It's almost guaranteed to be political. Because once you've convinced your political boss of something and you find out that it's wrong by scientific research, you're not going to go and tell them and risk your job. Establish national committees coordinated through national museums to research climate change. That's still within the bureaucracy, but the museums have a better understanding of the large-scale dynamics of man and nature. Annual conferences on different topics and time periods, including all subject areas, can be assigned, and annual publications of those proceedings can occur so that we're all on the same page doing the proper research. Napoleon said, never ascribe to malice that which is adequately explained by incompetence. But as I said, in law, if you premeditate something, that implies a malice. And so I will argue that what the IPCC have done was a deliberate plan, a premeditated plan to achieve a result, and they've done that very successfully. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you, Timothy.